Welcome to part 4 of the Sony A7V Beginner's Guide series. So what we're going to cover in this video is SNQ. So SNQ stands for slow and quick motion, as you can see on the dial here. So you just got to put that sub dial to SNQ mode there. And then the mode dial on the top works kind of how it did in all the other modes. So if you want it in full auto SNQ, you can just leave it in full auto, which is kind of cool. So you don't really have to know too much about aperture, shutter speed, and all these other things if you want to take advantage of these features. So again, Sony's keeping it nice and simple for you if you need it to be. Now, for somebody like me, I would probably be more likely to use manual mode when using these features. It just depends on what your use case is and your skill level. So with that being said, SNQ is basically slow motion video or time-lapse video, which will show you a lot of time passing quickly, very similar to this shot here down at the Basher kill. Now, focus does still work when shooting in SNQ mode, but it may be slower to respond depending on your frame rate settings, and there will be no sound recorded in SNQ mode or time-lapse mode. If you need sound, I would use the regular 4K 120 recording frame rate in regular video. Then you can slow it down in post and you'll have sound for regular speed playback if needed. This is what I use when I need to record sound and have slow motion. Now, for SNQ mode, you are going to need a good memory card. We already talked about memory cards, but you're going to need at least a V60 card. I recommend these V90 cards, which is what I use, or the CF Express cards, the really fast ones that Sony makes. You can also use those. That will work great. But you're going to need to have a pretty fast card to record at 120 frames per second at the high recording quality modes. So by default on the A7V, when you switch it to SNQ mode, I have it in video mode right now. When I switch it to SNQ, it's going to prompt you at this screen here. Now, this is where you can select between SNQ motion versus time-lapse. I just wanted to make sure you guys knew there actually are two options in the SNQ mode. So you can do slow and quick video with just SNQ. So you can technically get time-lapse with just SNQ. But in the time-lapse mode, you have the option to control a video light, and there's less frame rates to choose from because you're just doing time-lapse in that mode. So if you are doing time-lapse, I would recommend just go into the time-lapse area. Makes sense because you could have it set up for time-lapse. And then you can set up the SNQ for slow motion stuff, so you basically will have both. But like I said, you can technically use SNQ to get time-lapse as well. A little bit confusing, but not really once you see how the features are a little bit different. Now, if you guys are doing really hardcore time lapses, I would recommend doing it the old school way, taking photos. You know, it is a lot more work, but you're getting like the full resolution to work with. You have much more exposure control if you're shooting RAW, for example, and it gives you a ton of room to crop when you're using a full 33 megapixel file to create the time lapse. So there's another mode on this camera for that purpose, and it's called interval shooting function. So again, we're in full auto and in SNQ mode. So if we go into the menu here, we can pretty much control everything from the main area up here. We got main 2 and main 1. So if you go to main 2, see right here, this is where you can change it from SNQ to time-lapse. So let's just go to SNQ first. I'm going to go back into the menu here, and then we'll go up, and notice here, this is where you can set your SNQ settings. So if we go in here, this is where we have it set for slow motion. So this is going to be 24p is going to be my timeline for my video that I'm creating in Final Cut Pro, just as an example. But I'm going to be recording at 120 frames per second. So the camera's going to automatically slow that down 5 times. It says it right there, 5 times slow motion. So on camera, it's going to do that. So I don't have to slow it down in post. This is what makes SNQ so powerful. It does all the work for you. But you don't get sound. Again, I already mentioned that. So you can go over here and you can change your frame rate. So if you want to slow it down to just 60 frames, that'll give you 2.5 slow motion. This is a great option for shooting real estate because you don't need audio for real estate, and it'll slow the footage down for you on camera to 24p automatically, so you won't have to do that work in post-processing. So if you're a real estate shooter, this is a really good option here. Now you can also change the frame rate here if you're a 30 frames per second shooter and you prefer to use that for your timeline, then of course you can set it to 30. A lot of options there. I like 24, but you could also set it to 60 or 120 depending on what you're doing. Because remember, you can do time lapse here as well. So if we set the record frame rate, let's say to 24, and then we set our frames to 1 frames per second, this is going to give us a time lapse. So this is going to give us 24 times quick motion, which is basically a time lapse. So quick motion and time lapse are like the same thing, but they're using 2 different words here. So I just wanted to explain this in detail because it is a little bit confusing if you don't know the terminology and stuff. But how I tend to do it is I like to use this for slow motion. And if we go back here into the main area, you can set your file format here. Make sure you have this set how you want. I have it set to 4K. You can set it to HD if you want. And you have the different 4K options. I prefer the XAVC-S 4K or the HS option. The HS option is a little bit harder on computers because it's a more highly compressed format, but it's same good quality. It's just smaller file size, so the computer has to fight a little bit to open it up, like when playing back in like Final Cut, for example. So anyways, S is a good way to go there. Then if you go over to the right here, I have it set to the best quality, and that's what I prefer to use. I recommend you do the same. So at this point, we can just hit record, and it's going to be recording in slow motion. And because I'm in full auto mode, I don't have to worry about changing any settings. The camera's doing all the work for me. So now if I go into the playback menu here, I just want to play this back so you guys can see it. So there we go. Just hit play. It's going to take me a second to get my hand over there because this is slowed down so much. Here we go. See that? Slow motion on camera. And that's how it works. So S&Q mode is awesome for in-camera slow motion. Now, I just wanted to show you here, if you switch your file format to HD, so let's go to SHD here. Now let's go up to the frame rate settings, and now we have 240 frames per second. So this is HD quality, but it's going to slow down. If we switch this back to 24, this is going to give us 10 times slow motion, so double what the 120 is, which makes sense. 240 is double. So now again, remember we're in full auto mode. Now if I was doing this for real and I want the best quality possible, I would put the camera in manual mode. And remember, we're going to want to double the frame rate that we're shooting at. So in manual mode, if I go into the menu here, 240 frames per second, I would want to have the shutter speed double that. So that would be like 500 frames per second pretty much. Right around here. So 500 frames per second would be double the closest I can get to 240. So that's how I would want to have this pretty much set if I was recording in that mode. Now I don't really use 240 that often, so let's put it back to 4K. And we're back at 4K 120 like so. Now I'm in manual mode, so I am going to change the shutter speed now to double 120, which is 240. So the closest I can get is 1/250th of a second. So I would prefer to have it here, 1/250th of a second. And that's how I would have this set for recording slow motion in 4K 120. Now, if you need the exposure to float around when you're shooting, I would recommend having an auto ISO, which is how I have it. So it's an auto ISO. Now you could hard set the ISO to, you know, whatever value you want if you don't want the exposure to change. Now the exposure is not going to shift because everything is hard set. So that's the advantage of using manual mode. So if you want the exposure to float, you know, as the exposure changes in your scene, you can set the ISO to auto, even in manual mode. All right, so one other thing I wanted to show you guys is if you are shooting in S-Log, which is better quality, it's going to give you better quality video footage ultimately once edited, you know, it gives you more dynamic range and stuff like that for the more advanced video shooters. If you turn S-Log on here, I just want you to be aware that the base ISO for the Sony A7V is 800. So you are going to want to have the ISO set to 800 ideally. Now in flexible ISO, you can move the ISO around, but ideally you want it at one of the base ISOs. Now for regular type slow motion stuff, ISO 800 is fine. If you're in a lower light situation, the higher base ISO, the second base for the A7V is ISO 8000. So for astrophotography, for example, if you're doing time-lapse or whatever, you might want to use the 8000 if using S-Log in those lower light situations. But for me, in general, I'm in good lighting and whatnot, I'm going to use the S-Log ISO 800. Now, if I'm shooting wide open at f1.8, that might be a problem, especially if I want the shutter speed to be at a slower number. So in that case, we're going to have to go into the ND filter situation, which is just a tinted piece of glass that you can put on front of the lens. And that will help you lower the shutter speed number when you can't change the other factors, you know, due to shooting in S-Log, for example. So basically, you're just putting sunglasses on in front of the camera to help lower that shutter speed. So this is going to be important when it comes to time-lapse more than slow motion, because slow motion, you kind of have a pretty high frame rate, but it depends on how bright it is outside. If it's super bright out, the shutter speed, you're going to still need an ND filter, even at 1/250th of a second at f1.8. So you can stop the aperture down, of course, to lower the exposure, as you could see the screen getting darker if it's bright outside. But if you want that narrow depth of field, like at f1.8, then, you know, you're going to have to use an ND filter and stuff. So again, a little bit more advanced, but I cover this stuff in more detail in the photo video and the video video. So part 2 and part 3, I go into more detail into exposure using manual mode and all that stuff. So I'm just kind of crash coursing through it here a little bit. So again, when using S-Log, just keep that in mind. Now I'm just going to change this off S-Log for now, and we're going to go back to regular shooting. And I am going to put the ISO back in auto, just to keep things simple. So there we have it. All right, so let's talk about time lapse. So if I go into the menu here and we go down and we select the S&Q mode, so we're still in manual mode. If we select that, we can go into time lapse. So time lapse works a little bit differently. So if we go in there and we go up, here's the frame rate settings for time lapse. And notice the record frame rates, the file format and stuff is the same. So you're going to have to check that as well. Make sure you check that stuff. White balance, of course, guys. You're going to want to dial in your white balance if you don't want to use auto. I would recommend hard setting it for time-lapse especially. Slow motion, ultimately you want to hard set your ISO no matter what you're doing, but auto works pretty good. Slow motion, it's not as big of a deal, but time-lapse, you don't want those colors shifting with the white balance, you know, variant, especially if clouds are flowing over and whatnot. So keep that in mind. You might want to hard set this. So anyways, if we go up here to the frame rate settings, this is where you can go to set up your time lapse. So 24 frames per second at 1 second interval is pretty good for most situations, but you can go all the way up to 5 seconds. Now, why you might want 5 seconds or 4 seconds is if you're doing a time lapse and the stuff is moving very, very slowly. You know, like a flower opening and it's going to take like hours or something, or if the clouds are moving really slow, you can speed this up. But in general, I tend to use 1. For my experience, that's what I tend to use, and it works great. Now, a couple of pro tips for time lapse would be shutter speed. So you're going to want to try to have a little bit slower of a shutter speed, in my opinion, when doing time lapse, because you're going to want it to look as smooth as possible. So we can just click on this right there, and now we can go up and down with the shutter speed. You can see the shutter speed changing here. So what we really want for a shutter speed is somewhere low like this, like maybe even... So 1/8 of a second, somewhere, you might even want it less than that. And what that's going to do is every time it takes a shot, it's going to allow for a little bit of motion blur. So if cars are driving past, people are walking, it's going to give just that little bit of motion blur for each frame. And then when the time lapse is like put together at the end, the blur will be there and it'll like look kind of correct for the human eye. So you definitely, ideally, want to capture a little bit of motion when doing time-lapse. Sometimes you just can't do that depending on the frame rate, the lighting, whether you have an ND filter or not. But in this case, you're definitely going to need an ND filter to have these slow shutter speeds in bright conditions. So in my case here, I could see that it's a little bit bright. It looks like you could see on the histogram it's a little bit bright. So I'm just going to dial the aperture down a little bit until the ISO stops blinking. Okay, right there. So right there, we're looking pretty good. So for this particular scene right here, for a time lapse, we're at 1/8 of a second, f5.6, ISO 100, auto white balance, which again, I would consider hard setting that to something other than auto. If you're in the sun, set it to daylight, for example. And there we go. Now we are ready to go. And all we have to do is hit record and we'll get like a nice time lapse. All right, so one last tip that I want to give you for when shooting time lapses in particular is the focus. So I would recommend focusing the camera on what you want. Once the focus is set, then I would go into the function menu, or you can press this button right here where it says AFC. So if you go in the function menu, it says AFC right there. You could select that. I would switch it to manual focus. Now the focus isn't going to shift. So you just lock it like where you want. Just make sure you focus first, like what you want, and then switch it to manual. And then you're good to go at that point. The focus is not going to shift during the time lapse. So if somebody were to walk in front of your camera, it's not going to focus on them and then go back to the background, which is going to create this pulsing type phenomenon. And that would be how I would recommend setting the camera for S&Q mode. Now again, you can use shutter priority, you can use aperture priority, or you can just go full-fledged auto if you want and just let the camera do all the work for you. So this is a very versatile feature. And even when you're in full auto mode, you can change the lens to manual focus. So I would still do that if you're doing a time lapse in full auto. It allows you to do that. You can't change a lot of the other settings, so you can't worry about that stuff. But the focus you can change, so this way it won't pulse on you when doing a time lapse. All right, so one other thing I wanted to talk about for the time lapse S&Q mode is the settings for the video light. So this is another thing that we can do. So if we go in here to time-lapse settings and we go over to the right, notice how we have the frame rate. This is the same options from the main area that we were adjusting earlier, but in the menu we get this other option here for the video light. Now if we hit the garbage can here, it will explain, sets the video light illumination setting during time-lapse shooting. So they make proprietary video lights you can plug into the hot shoe here, and that'll automatically turn on and off like as the time-lapse is going. So you can dial that in right here. So you can set it for the number of seconds sort of thing. And that's how that works. It'll actually work as an interval for you. So this is why, again, why time-lapse is a little bit different than the S&Q, because it gives you this feature here for video lights. And this is great for like nighttime if you're recording and you're actually trying to light something at the same time. Again, like what, you know, those flowers that bloom under the moon, just as an example, something like that. You might want to use a video light and have it synchronized, you know, otherwise the battery will die. So that's how this works. All right, guys, that about wraps up this S&Q and time-lapse video. I really hope you got what you were looking for. And please stay tuned for the next video. I got a bunch of other stuff I still want to cover, such as customizing the camera, because there are so many ways to customize this depending on your use case. All right, guys. I will catch up with you next time, and thanks again for watching my video, and please stay tuned for more by subscribing, maybe giving me a thumbs up if you found this video useful. That would be super cool as well. All right, guys, have a great day.